From the old CPL signals and to the more modern and sleek Vader signals, the CSX system and other railroads in general have changed a lot over time. At one point, CSX had 3 different routes to St. Louis, having routes from Evansville, Vincennes, and Terre Haute, Indiana. In this video, we'll be discussing some of the trains, how the 3 CSX lines are, what has happened, and so on. So sit back and enjoy. Alright, so the first route we're going to be talking about is the CSX St. Louis line. This route runs from Terre Haute, Indiana, and into St. Louis at the Rose Lake Yard. This right here is the only route that CSX now uses to St. Louis for their freight. Basically, throughout the 90s and into modern day, CSX would condense all freight traffic from all 3 lines onto just this St. Louis line. The St. Louis line ranges from mainly mixed freight and intermodal traffic. However, Union Pacific also has trackage rights on portions of the St. Louis line. A prime example being CSX trains I-131 and I-132 to and from Selkirk, New York to Salem, Illinois, running on the UP as IWT-SMJ and ISM-WTJ. Now, half of these trains just seem to be the trackage right UP trains, a lot of times often having UP power. Another good example is Union Pacific train M&PIN from North Platte, Nebraska to Indianapolis, Indiana, which gets interchanged to the CSX, runs as M686 or M684. The line was first owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad before merging with NYC to make the Penn Central and going into the hands of Conrail. And once Conrail was halfway split between NS and CSX, the CSX Transportation would get a hold of this St. Louis line. Now, there are more trains once you get east of Terre Haute, with some traffic coming off the CE&D sub where the subdivision name changes to the Indianapolis line. But mainly, we'll just be staying focused on the west end of all of these subdivisions that ran to St. Louis. Now, more oftentimes than not, rail traffic on the St. Louis line mostly seems busier overnight or during the evening hours. The line was first completed in 1870 and by 2 main lines in Terre Haute. From the east end, you had the Indianapolis and St. Louis Railroad, and then on the west of Terre Haute was the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad and the St. Louis, Vandalia, and Terre Haute Railroad on the Illinois side. Also in 1870, before these companies would become a part of the PRR. The St. Louis line crosses over the Canadian National Champaign subdivision at Effingham, and the UP Salem subdivision briefly joins the line from Altamont to St. Elmo, and also crosses the BNSF Beardstown sub in Smithborough, and sometimes even interchanging trains there as well. It would also interchange with the small Vandalia Railroad in Vandalia before eventually making its way into the Washington Park area, going next to its Illinois subdivision at the Rose Lake Yard, where the line ultimately ends at. From 1971 to 1979, the Amtrak National Limited from New York to St. Louis would run on the St. Louis line as well at one point, and making a stop at Effingham. There isn't really a lot more to be said about this line, but this is pretty much the only line that CSX fully uses to St. Louis now. The other 2 routes that we're about to talk about are still open, but they have been cut off from St. Louis entirely. Alright, now it is time to talk about the former L&N main from Evansville to St. Louis. Now, what's left of this railroad line is owned by a different company now. It is now owned by the Evansville and Western, or EVWR for short, which took over the operations for CSX in January of 2006. The Evansville and Western is headquartered in Mount Vernon, Indiana. Not to be confused with Illinois. This is what the railroad looks like, having some nice green colored engines and some lease units along the side. The roster on this railroad is small, but they pull some locals and coal traffic and some grain traffic. Now, even though this is owned by a different company now, a lot of CSX can still be seen on this line. And, well, CSX owns EVWR, so technically they still have this line. CSX has trackage rides on the Evansville and Western, running coal trains and sometimes grain and potash trains. Once you get into the town of McLeansboro, Illinois, you'll start seeing a lot more traffic on the EVWR than what you do on the West End. Norfolk Southern and Canadian National and EVWR themselves will all power coal trains as well. Some originating out of Mount Vernon, Indiana, and some originating way down south from the CSX. There are 2 of these coal mines that the Evansville and Western serves. They serve the White Oak Mine in Hamilton County in Delafield, Illinois, and down south, the Savatrans built a spur going down to Macedonia, Illinois, where the Sugar Camp Mine is, that runs next to the Sewerslvt subdivision, or also known as the Edgewood Cutoff. I'd say there are only about 4 to 6 coal trains a day. While the portion from Oakville to St. Louis is ripped out, it's great to see that this Class 2 railroad has revived some traffic on this old L&N main line. Now let's go ahead and take a quick look at the west end of the Evansville and Western. Alright, so we're back on Google Earth, and I'm going to show you where the Evansville and Western ends at today. So, right here, we are in the town of Oakville, Illinois, and right here at this top ag grain elevator is the furthest west that the EVWR runs. EVWR will take some grain trains and put them right here and load them up. And here, as you can see, the track goes all the way on through here, and this is where it ultimately ends, where the track would continue west through Belleville, Illinois, and so on to St. Louis. So let's open up a street view here. Now, on the west end of the EVWR, there is only really 1 train a day, and it doesn't even run every single day. It is pretty random for this Evansville and Western local to run out over here. Now, once you get east of Mount Vernon, Illinois, you will also see coal trains from the Norfolk Southern, but they are also random and as needed. So, these NS coal trains 430 and 431 sometimes take the Evansville Western interchange at Mount Vernon and go to Abbey, Indiana. Pretty much, the further east you go on this line, the more trains that you will start to see pop up on this line, and mainly just coal trains. The Evansville and Western has a bigger yard in Mount Vernon, Indiana, and has a smaller yard in McLeansboro, Illinois. A lot of the times, these trains will tie down and swap crews at random spots, and it's definitely a more interesting operation that this railroad does. Now, back in the CSX days, the portion between Oakville and St. Louis would be abandoned around 1990, and in 1993, the rails from Oakville to St. Louis would be ripped up. Now, fun fact, the rails were supposed to be ripped up from St. Louis and all the way to Woodlawn, Illinois, where it would cross over the BNSF Beardstown sub. But thankfully, the rails stayed all the way into Oakville, Illinois because of some farmers. The Evansville and Western would cross over the Sewerslvt subdivision at Bell Drive using a bridge, and at a diamond, the UVWR would cross the Union Pacific Mount Vernon sub at Mount Vernon, and over the BNSF Beardstown sub of Woodlawn, as I had mentioned, and the Canadian National Centralia sub at Ashley. The UVWR interchanges freight with both the BNSF and UP, and the CSX in Evansville. And at one point, BNSF would also run grain trains to the UVWR. They ran one phosphate train this year, but it's the only one that's happened, and it was probably just a one-off deal, and there hasn't been a grain train since 2019, which was also a one-time thing. They would regularly run up until around 2015 or so. Now, throughout the entire line, all the trains are about speed restricted to 25 to 30 miles an hour. so chasing on this line should be fairly easy. The local on this line is bidirectional and originates out of McLeansboro, Illinois. Typically in the early mornings, it'll head eastward or southbound towards Mount Vernon, Indiana, and will return westbound or northbound back to McLeansboro, Illinois. Then later on, another crew hops on in the evening into the nighttime and runs out towards the Illinois side of Mount Vernon. Sometimes though, the train could turn around and go back at Mount Vernon, Woodlawn, Nashville, or on the more uncommon occasion, run all the way to Oakville for a grain train. It just all varies at this point. But that's really all I gotta say about this line. But this last line that we're talking about, I would say, ended up getting the worst fate of them all. Yep, out of all the CSX routes that had gotten hit towards St. Louis, the Illinois sub definitely got hit the hardest. This is the B&O route from Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way to St. Louis, the other line that would also run by the Rose Lake Yard. Basically, the Illinois sub is on life support. In its last years of freight service declining, there were only 4 trains left on the line. In 2015, on its last months, only trains Q234, Q274, Q265, and Q204 would be the last 4 trains to operate on that line in full service. But then later on, in August of 2015, the worst would happen, and the west end of the Illinois sub, from the Rose Lake Yard all the way to Flora, Illinois, would get axed hard. From sidings being ripped out, railroad crossing lights getting turned, tracks out of service signs, tracks exempt, and even some interlockers getting ripped out, the Illinois subdivision on the west side would start going in terrible conditions. The Illinois subdivision was pretty much a parallel route with the St. Louis line, but the St. Louis line was always more efficient to use, and CSX just pretty much finally condensed all traffic to the St. Louis line. But well, it would have been nice to get the full Illinois subdivision as a backup use, like maybe for reroutes or something if a derailment or anything else would happen on the St. Louis line. This line definitely didn't deserve the plug, but the West End got the plug anyway. Alright, so let's take a look more on the West End at Google Earth. We're going to head to the town of Shattuck, Illinois, where it crossed the BNSF Beardstown sub. You see the diamonds ripped off, and there was an old connection up there, and I actually seen some maintenance of way sitting on there at one point recently. But on the street view, pretty much west of Flora, Illinois, all of these crossings look like this. The gates are gone, the lights are turned, and it's just all pretty screwed up in general over here. And over here at the very west end, we're going to look at the spot in Caseyville, Illinois, where the Illinois sub runs next to the St. Louis line. The track on top is the St. Louis line. The track on the bottom is the Illinois sub. Now, if you notice something pretty cool, the crossings are still here. The crossings are still active because, well, I do believe they stored bear tables on this little section at one point. Now, I don't know if I can find any stored cars, but this is as of 2021, and the crossing here in Caseyville is still active. And just up there, that is the St. Louis line, the former Pennsy main that we had just talked about first in the video, which of course the St. Louis line is the only route used now. And the diamonds at Shattuck, Odin, and even the diamond in Salem was just recently ripped up earlier this year. Really not giving hope. There's the bear table cars that was stored on the line. But now let's turn this way, and right here, this crossing is also still active. It looks like none of the lights are turned or anything. The gates are still there. But then when you move to literally the very next road over, that crossing has been turned and possibly deactivated as well by CSX. And as I was just talking about stored cars earlier, CSX had stored some cars on the line In 2017, just 2 years after the Illinois sub had went out of service on the West End, this is a photo and from the WordPress that the Illinois subdivision was briefly, quote, reopened for the storage move, and the cars will get dropped off just west of Shattuck. 2 years later, a lone SD40-2 would pick these cars up and take it out, and nothing has happened on the West End since then, aside from the line just pretty much deteriorating.
Last week I done this one, the week before.
Well, at least the entire line isn't axed yet, but just east of Vincent's, the line is called the Indiana subdivision. And well, over on this side of the Illinois subdivision, there are still 3 trains left that are as needed. First, you have the Vincent's local L364 that sometimes only runs to Olney, but other times will run to Flora to its customer, Silgan Plastics. And as you see, that was pretty much where the end of the line goes to. The furthest a train still reaches out on the Illinois sub. As you had seen, the L&N nose that I had caught on the Illinois sub working. And the other 2 trains that only regularly run this line are CSX trains G057 and G058 to the grain elevator in Olney, Illinois. As sad as it is to see the current state of the Illinois subdivision with not many trains left, and the entire West End being killed off, it's at least better than nothing and shows that we really need to be grateful for what we have. You might not know what you really have until it's gone. Well, there are possible rumors of the Illinois subdivision from Flora to Shattuck getting reactivated, as it might go into effect for the CSX BNSF intermodal contract, using the full connection at Shattuck for trains to hop onto the Beardstown sub. But as CSX might say, the St. Louis line already exists, and there's already a connection at Smithboro, Illinois that the trains could also go up on, and yes, this connection is still used for some run-through trains. And as the truth, you can't believe what everyone says on the internet. Thanks for watching.